Salt and survival were the only truths the sea had left him. Dr. Elias Eris coughed up a lungful of brine, his body shuddering against the coarse, black sand of an unknown shore. The storm had been a monstrous, living thing, tearing his research vessel apart with indifferent fury. Now silence reigned, broken only by the dull, rhythmic crash of waves and a low, pervasive hum that seemed to emanate from the island itself. He pushed himself onto his elbows, his academic's mind, trained for observation, struggling against a primal, rising dread. The island was a study in monochrome. A thick, woolly fog clung to everything, muting the light of a sun he could not see, smearing the outlines of gnarled, wind-twisted trees into spectral shapes. The air was heavy and cold, carrying the scent of wet rot and something else, something metallic and faintly organic, like old blood. In the distance, jagged peaks pierced the gray blanket of mist, their summits lost to view. It was a landscape forgotten by time, a place that demanded obscurity. His scientific curiosity, a flickering candle in the cavern of his fear, noted the complete absence of familiar sounds. No bird calls, no chittering of insects. Only the fog and the humming silence. As he staggered to his feet, his waterlogged clothes clinging to him like a second skin, figures emerged from the mist. They did not approach with haste or alarm, but with a slow, deliberate unison that was more unnerving than any charge. A dozen of them, perhaps more, materialized from the gray, and as they drew nearer, the candle of his curiosity guttered. Their faces. It was their faces that stole the breath from his lungs. They were all the same. Not similar, not familial, but identical. The same high cheekbones, the same narrow-set eyes of a murky, indeterminate color, the same thin, unsmiling lips. It was as if a single mask had been pressed onto a dozen different bodies, a flaw in creation that made his stomach clench. They moved with a quiet synchronicity, their footfalls a single soft sound on the damp earth. An older man, distinguished only by a longer, grayer beard and a staff of polished driftwood, stepped forward. This Eris presumed was their leader. The man's eyes, the same as all the others, held a depth the younger ones lacked, a weary intelligence that assessed Eris with a guarded hospitality. "I am Elder Kale," the man said, his voice a dry rustle, perfectly matching the desolate landscape. "You are a stranger. Come. The fog holds chill, and the night will be cold." Eris nodded, his throat too tight for words. As he was led inland, the village came into view, a cluster of low, sod-roofed huts huddled together as if for warmth. It was then, walking among them, that he noticed the subtle imperfections, the cracks in the perfect mirror. A young man carrying a bundle of wood had a right arm that hung slightly shorter and more twisted than the left. A woman drawing water from a well had one eye that drooped ever so slightly, giving her identical face a lopsided, mournful cast. Misshapen limbs, asymmetrical eyes, a slight limp in an otherwise synchronized gait. These small deformities were scattered throughout the community, a silent testament to something deeply wrong. Elder Kale led him to a hut slightly larger than the others and gestured for him to enter. The offer of shelter was clear, but the hospitality felt like a transaction, the terms of which were yet unknown. Inside, the air was smoky and close. A pallet of dried grasses was indicated as his bed. Left alone, Eris sat on the rough bedding, the profound isolation of the place seeping into his bones. It was more than just geographical isolation. It was a separation from the very spectrum of humanity. He watched through the open doorway as the villagers went about their evening tasks. They rarely spoke. Instead, a tilt of a head, a slight gesture of a hand, seemed to convey entire conversations. This silent communication was more than custom. It hinted at a shared understanding so deep it bypassed the need for words, a terrifying intimacy born of what he could only guess was a profoundly shared genetics. The anthropologist in him was fascinated, a coiled spring of questions. The man, the castaway, was simply and utterly afraid. The invitation was not spoken but conveyed through a series of gestures so fluid they felt like a shared thought. A young man with a crooked finger had simply appeared at the doorway of Eris's hut, nodded once, and turned, expecting to be followed. The path led to the largest structure in the village, a longhouse whose timber walls seemed to absorb the fading twilight. Smoke, thick and fragrant with an unfamiliar herb, curled from a hole in its sod roof, and the low, resonant murmur of many voices gathered inside promised a semblance of community, a warmth Eris desperately craved after the chilling silence of the island. Stepping through the low entrance was like crossing a threshold into another world. The air within was heavy and warm, thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and simmering food. Dozens of torches crackled in iron sconces, their flickering light dancing across the faces of the assembled villagers, amplifying their sameness into a sea of repeating features that made Eris's head swim. They sat on rough-hewn benches at long tables, their identical eyes reflecting the flames, all turned towards him as he entered. The murmur died, replaced by a watchful quiet. Elder Kale sat at the head of the central table and gestured for Eris to take the empty space to his right. It was a place of honor, yet it felt like being placed in a specimen jar. A deep earthenware bowl was set before him, its contents a thick, dark stew from which tendrils of steam rose, carrying a rich, savory aroma that made his empty stomach clench with sudden, sharp hunger. It smelled of roasted meat and root vegetables, a profoundly normal scent that was a balm to his frayed nerves. He picked up the carved bone spoon beside the bowl, his manners as an anthropologist warring with the survivor's need to eat. The first spoonful was hearty, warming him from the inside. He ate with a gratitude that momentarily blinded him to the details. It was only as he scooped a second mouthful that his eyes, trained to notice the minutiae of human culture, caught on a fragment rising from the depths of his bowl. It was a piece of bone, small and curved, perhaps a rib. It was clean, stripped of meat by the long simmering, but not entirely featureless. A pattern was etched into its surface, faded but unmistakable. A series of interlocking circles, a sailor's knot. Recognition was a cold knife in his gut. He had seen that exact tattoo on the forearm of his ship's cook, a jovial man named Davy, just hours before the storm had hit. The spoon froze halfway to his mouth. He looked down into the stew, his vision sharpening, and saw other fragments. A sliver of bone too large to be from any island fauna, a piece of gristle with a texture that was horribly, intimately familiar. The savory smell curdled in his nostrils, becoming the stench of a charnel house. He lowered the spoon, his appetite replaced by a rising gorge. Elder Kale had been watching him. The old man's face showed no surprise, only a weary understanding. He leaned closer, his voice a low murmur meant only for Eris. He spoke not of apology, but of necessity. He described the island's cruel economy, the barren soil that yielded little, the seas that offered only meager, seasonal bounty. He spoke of the long winters, of the choice that had faced their ancestors generations ago. Perish entirely or find sustenance in the one resource that never failed them, themselves. It was not a practice of malice, he insisted, but of continuity. A way to ensure that the strength of the community was never lost, but recycled, honored. As Kale spoke, a young woman approached the table to refill a water jug. She moved with a pronounced limp, one shoulder dipping with each step, a jarring dissonance in the synchronized quiet of the hall. Her eyes, the same as all the others, were downcast, avoiding Eris's gaze. Her hands trembled as she lifted the heavy jug, and when she set it down, her fingers brushed against his arm. The contact was fleeting, but it was electric with a fear so palpable it was almost a sound. This was Alara. In her trembling hands and averted eyes, Eris saw not the placid acceptance of the others, but a mirror of his own horror. It was then that Elder Kale delivered the final, chilling piece of the evening's liturgy. The feast, he explained, was not merely a meal. It was a sacrament. It honored those who had recently passed, integrating their essence back into the whole. The death of one strengthened the many. The community consumed its losses so that it might never be diminished. The recent storm, Kale said without looking at Eris's bowl, had, as always, provided. The morality Eris had carried from the outside world, with its clear lines between right and wrong, crumbled against the stark, unassailable logic of survival. He sat amidst the quiet, consuming crowd, a man caught between the horror of the act and the terrifying understanding of its reason, the steam from his bowl clouding his vision like the island's perpetual fog. The feast had left a residue in Eris's soul, a greasy film of horror that no amount of dawn light could scrub away. The following morning, under a sky still bruised with the memory of fog, he walked through the village, his anthropologist's gaze now sharpened by a survivor's paranoia. The huts, which had seemed merely primitive the day before, now revealed a more macabre architecture. Their walls were not just woven from branches and mud. They were adorned. Rib cages, bleached white by sun and salt, were fitted over doorframes like Gothic arches. Skulls, some small and delicate, stared out from niches in the walls, their empty sockets tracking his progress. Femurs and tibias were lashed together to form fences, creating a grisly palisade that enclosed small, barren gardens. It was a community built from its own dead, a literal skeleton of its history. The silence was punctuated by the high, thin sounds of children at play. He found them in a small clearing between the huts, their games a mimicry of adult chores, stacking stones, drawing patterns in the dirt. But it was their faces, their small bodies, that arrested him. The genetic echo that created the adults' unnerving similarity was amplified in the young, but so too were the flaws. A little girl, no older than 5, laughed as she chased a ball, her mouth a gaping maw where a cleft palate had never been repaired. A boy tugging on a makeshift toy displayed a hand with 6 fingers, the extra digit moving with a life of its own. Another child turned, and Eris saw one eye was a milky, sightless blue, while the other was the familiar murky gray of the village. These were not the subtle asymmetries of the adults. These were the bold, undeniable strokes of decay, the shadows of the past written on the youngest generation. It was Alara who found him watching, her limp a soft scuffing sound on the hard-packed earth. She did not speak, but her presence was an acknowledgement of the horror he was witnessing. She led him away from the clearing, not back towards the center of the village, but to its edge, where the huts were more dilapidated and the bone adornments more sparse. They stopped beside a grove of stunted, twisted trees, their branches clawing at the sky. She gestured towards the dark line of the forest beyond. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper, as if afraid the trees themselves might hear. She spoke of the founding, a story passed down through 5 generations. A ship, much larger than Eris's own, had been thrown against the island's razor rocks in a storm far greater than the one he had survived. The few dozen survivors had found a prison instead of a refuge. The island offered no means of escape and little means of sustenance. The initial hope of rescue had curdled into despair, and despair had hardened into a grim acceptance of their perpetual isolation. Then, her whisper dropping even lower, she spoke of the mad ones. Those for whom the isolation, the diet, the relentless sameness had become too much. They were the ones who wandered into the forests, she said, her eyes wide with a fear that was both for them and of becoming them. They forgot their names, their families, and were said to live like animals, their howls sometimes echoing through the trees on still nights. It was a fate she feared more than the monthly lottery, a dissolution of self that was the community's ultimate inheritance. Seeing the understanding, and perhaps a shared fear, in his eyes, she made a decision. With a furtive glance around, she knelt and brushed away a layer of leaves and dirt beside the base of a particularly gnarled tree. Her fingers probed the earth until they found a loose stone, which she pried up to reveal a small, hollow space. From it, she withdrew an object wrapped in oilskin, brittle and stained with age. It was a journal, its leather cover cracked and its pages threatening to crumble to dust. She placed it in his hands with a reverence usually reserved for relics. The journal was from the first generation, she explained, written by a woman who had been a passenger on the doomed ship. As Eris carefully turned the fragile pages, the elegant, fading script told a story far more precise and damning than oral tradition. It detailed the initial struggles, the deaths from injury and hunger. But then, it coldly documented the deliberations, the terrible choices. With no new genetic material, the survivors had turned inward. The journal spoke of pairings not of love or even compatibility, but of necessity. Cousins with cousins, then uncles with nieces. The writer noted the births, the initial relief at any live child, followed by the dawning horror at the first stillbirth, the first infant with a heart defect, the first child who did not survive its first winter. It was a clinical record of the first deliberate steps down a path of genetic decay, the original sin that had led to the children in the clearing and the mad ones in the wood. The legacy was not just one of survival, but of a slow, inexorable unraveling, and Eris held its first chapter in his trembling hands. The moon, when it rose, was a pale, bloated coin behind the veil of fog, its light insufficient to banish the shadows that pooled thickly in the center of the village. The entire community had gathered, forming a wide, silent ring around a flat stone dais that Eris had previously mistaken for a simple meeting place. Now he understood its true purpose. The air was charged with a grim solemnity, a collective inhalation of dread and resignation. Torches, held aloft by villagers on the perimeter, cast a flickering, uneven light that made the circle of identical faces seem to pulse in and out of existence, a single organism awaiting a necessary amputation. Elder Kale stood upon the dais, his presence a pillar of calm authority in the tense stillness. In his hands he held a simple clay pot. The ritual, Eris realized, was devoid of pomp or prayer. It was a bureaucratic horror, a matter of grim accounting. Kale's voice cut through the silence, explaining the necessity of the lottery in the same tone he might use to describe crop rotation. One must be chosen each month, he said, to maintain the balance. The community could not support all, and so one would sustain the many. It was the island's most fundamental law, as immutable as the tides. Kale passed the pot around the circle. Each villager, from the eldest to those barely of age, reached in and drew a small, smooth stone. Most were dark gray. Eris watched, his heart thudding against his ribs, as the stones were revealed, one after another. The silence was so profound he could hear the soft clack of each pebble being dropped back into the pot. The tension was a physical weight, pressing down on the gathering. The pot came to a man named Bren, who stood with a quiet dignity a few people away from Eris. Bren was perhaps in his fourth decade, his identical features etched with the same weariness as the others, but his shoulders were square, his gaze steady. He reached into the pot, his movements slow and deliberate. When his fingers emerged, they held a single bone-white stone. A collective sigh, not of surprise but of grim fulfillment, rustled through the crowd. Bren did not flinch. He did not cry out or protest. He simply looked at the white stone in his palm, then closed his fingers around it and nodded once to Elder Kale. His acceptance was absolute, a resignation so deep it was indistinguishable from peace. He stepped into the circle and mounted the dais, standing beside Kale, his fate sealed. The community's reaction was not grief, but a quiet, terrifying relief. The balance had been maintained. The horror was in the calm, the way the community watched one of their own consign himself to death with the passive acceptance of a leaf falling from a tree. Later, as the crowd dispersed with a quiet efficiency that chilled Eris more than any panic would have, Elara found him. She tugged him into the deep shadow between two huts, her face a mask of contained fury and fear. Her breath misted in the cold air as she confided in a rushed, hushed whisper. She suspected the lottery was not the act of chance it appeared to be. The white stone, she believed, was cold, always kept separate from the others. It was placed in the pot only when Kale's hand, and not a villager's, was the last to touch it before the drawing began. The lottery, she insisted, was a tool, a sanitized method for Elder Kale to purge the community of anyone who asked too many questions, who showed signs of dissent, or who, like a man with a twisted arm that made him a less efficient worker, was deemed a burden. Bren, she revealed, had recently been heard questioning the wisdom of storing food for the winter in a particular location. His fate had been decided not by chance, but by control. Driven by a morbid scientific compulsion, Eris needed to see the conclusion. He slipped away from Elara and followed a group of men who were carrying Bren's body, already cleaned and prepared with a swift, practiced efficiency, to a low, smoky hut set apart from the others, a place that smelled perpetually of blood and smoke. Peering through a crack in the wall, Eris watched as the men laid Bren on a heavy wooden table. It was not the act of butchery that held his gaze, though that was horror enough. It was the body itself. Stripped of its rough clothing, Bren's form was exposed under the flickering light of a single tallow candle. And in death, under the clinical gaze of the anthropologist, the truth became undeniable. The proportions of his limbs, the specific curve of his clavicle, the set of his jaw, even in repose, they were a perfect match to the men preparing him. But it was more than that. As one of the men turned to select a tool, his profile was caught in the candlelight. He had the same distinct, slightly hooked nose as Bren. Another, bending over the table, revealed the same pattern of moles across his shoulder blades. These were not just familial resemblances. They were replicas. The villagers were not merely inbred. They were converging, their genetic code whittled down to a handful of dominant patterns. Bren was not just a member of the community, he was a copy of it, and in consuming him they were quite literally consuming themselves. The sacrifice was not just about survival, but about enforcing a terrifying, homogenized unity, a circle of blood that fed upon its own diminishing returns. The cave mouth was a black scar on the hillside, half hidden by a curtain of thorny vines that seemed to clutch at the rock with malevolent intent. It was a place the villagers pointedly avoided, their glances skittering away from it as if the darkness itself could leach the sameness from their souls. For Eris, that avoidance was an irresistible lure. The journal's brittle pages had given him the history, but the cave, he felt certain, held the physical evidence, the bone-deep truth of the island's decay. Under the cover of a moonless, starless night, with the village sunk into a silence so profound it felt like death, he slipped away, the damp chill of the air clinging to him like a shroud. Pushing through the vines was like entering the throat of some great beast. The air inside was cold and still, carrying the ancient scent of wet stone and something else, something dry and faintly alkaline, like old bone dust. The darkness was absolute, a tangible pressure against his eyes. He fumbled with the flint and tinder he had stolen, his hands shaking not from the cold, but from a visceral dread. The small torch he managed to ignite sputtered to life, its feeble glow pushing back the blackness just enough to reveal the cave's true horror. The walls were not smooth. They were covered in carvings, etched into the soft stone with painstaking, generations-long effort. He moved the torch closer, the light dancing over the images. They were not pictures of gods or hunting scenes, but a stark, terrifying timeline. The first panels showed a diverse group of people, men and women with different features, different builds, disembarking from a stylized ship. But as his eyes traced the narrative along the wall, the figures began to change. Their features simplified, homogenized. The variations in height and shape diminished. Then the deformities began to appear. Extra digits on hands, spines curving into painful-looking arcs, skulls misshapen. Each generation was depicted with a brutal, unflinching clarity, a chart of accelerating genetic collapse. It was a visual echo of the journal's words, a genealogy of ruin carved in stone. His foot kicked against something that skittered away into the darkness with a dry, rattling sound. He lowered the torch. The floor of the cave was littered with bones. But these were not the cleaned, curated bones that adorned the village huts. These were skeletons left in their final postures of rest or agony. He moved deeper, the torchlight illuminating a grisly tableau. Here was a skeleton with a pelvis twisted so severely it was a wonder the individual could have walked. There, a skull with a cleft palate so wide it gaped like a second mouth. Farther in, a child's small frame displayed ribs fused together in a solid, bony plate. The remains were arranged not with reverence, but with a cold, taxonomic purpose, a museum of the unfit, those whose imperfections had been too great even for the island's brutal pragmatism. They were the physical record of the carvings on the wall, the failed experiments cast aside into the dark. A soft scuffing sound from the cave entrance made him spin around, his heart hammering against his ribs. A figure stood silhouetted against the slightly less profound blackness of the night. For a terrifying moment, he thought it was one of the mad ones Alara had whispered of. But then the figure limped forward into the circle of his torchlight. It was Alara. Her face, a mirror of every other face in the village, was pale and streaked with tears that gleamed in the flickering light. She had followed him. She did not speak at first. Her eyes traveled over the carvings, over the skeletal remains, and a sob caught in her throat. She moved to a small, delicate skeleton tucked into a shallow alcove, its bones so small they could only have belonged to a child. Her trembling hand reached out, but did not touch the fragile remains. When her voice finally came, it was a raw whisper, torn from a place of old, unhealed grief. She spoke of a sister, a twin. Two girls born from the same womb with the same face, a perfect duplication in a community that was already striving for uniformity. For a time, their identicalness had been celebrated, seen as a sign of purity. But as they grew, a difference emerged, not in their features, but in their spirits. Where Alara was quiet and compliant, her sister was curious, questioning, her eyes always looking toward the sea as if she could see a world beyond the fog. She was different on the inside, and on the island that was the only difference that mattered. Alara's whisper broke as she described the lottery that had not been a lottery at all. The white stone had been meant for her sister, a punishment for asking why the sky was blue when the sea was gray, for wondering if birds ever flew to lands without bones in the walls. Alara's grief surfaced then, not as a gentle sadness, but as a convulsive wave of anguish. She described the last time she saw her twin, not on a funeral pyre or a butcher's table, but alive, standing in the circle, her face, Alara's own face, staring back at her with a confusion that had curdled into terror. She had watched her other self, her mirrored soul, be led away for the crime of being too different. The cave was not just a repository for bones. It was the vault where Alara kept her most painful secret, the memory of a face that was her own, sacrificed to the brutal god of conformity. In the whispering dark, surrounded by the bones of the unwanted, her loss became a tangible thing, another skeleton in the island's crowded tomb. The tension in the village was a slow-burning fuse, lit by the revelations in the cave and fed by the silent, smoldering grief in Alara's eyes. It found its voice in the crooked spine of Joran. He was a man whose body was a testament to the island's decay, his severe scoliosis twisting his torso into a painful question mark, setting him apart in a community that worshipped sameness. For years, he had borne his difference with a quiet resentment, but the sight of Bren's placid acceptance at the lottery had snapped something inside him. The fuse reached its end. It happened at the evening gathering, as Elder Kale began his customary homily on the virtues of unity and the necessity of their traditions. Joran stepped forward from the crowd, his movement a jerky, unbalanced defiance that drew every eye. His voice, when it came, was rough and loud, cracking the shell of resigned silence that usually enveloped the villagers. He did not speak in subtle arguments or whispered doubts. He named the horror outright. He called the cannibalism what it was, an abomination, a failure of spirit, not a necessity of survival. He pointed a trembling, accusing finger at Kale, his words painting a picture of a future where they were not a community, but a self-consuming swarm, eating their way toward extinction one identical body at a time. Eris watched from the periphery, his own heart hammering in sync with Joran's impassioned speech. Here was the rebellion he had felt brewing in his own soul, given form and voice. The villagers shifted uncomfortably, a ripple of unease moving through them. Some looked at the ground, their identical features clouded with confusion. A few others, mostly the younger men and women with their own subtle deformities, looked at Joran with a flicker of something dangerous, agreement. In that moment, Eris made his choice. He stepped out of the shadows and stood beside Joran, a silent but unmistakable alliance. His presence, the presence of the outsider, lent a terrifying credibility to the rebellion. Later, under the cover of deep night, they met in the lee of Joran's hut, the air cold and sharp with conspiracy. Joran's eyes burned with a frantic energy. He had a plan, one born of a lifetime staring at the horizon. He would build a raft. He had been secretly gathering materials for months. Driftwood from the northern shore, lengths of tough, fibrous vine. He knew the currents, he claimed. He had studied them from the cliffs, a lonely pastime for a man who did not fit in. He spoke of a land to the south, a place from an old story, a place without bones in the stew or lotteries under the moon. It was a desperate, mad plan, but to Eris, it was the only plan that held a shred of hope. They agreed to begin the very next night, to construct their fragile vessel of escape from the wreckage of the island. But the village had ears, and fear was a faster messenger than hope. The following evening, before Eris and Joran could make their first move, Elder Kale called the entire community together. He did not stand on the dais of sacrifice, but among them, his presence a calm, chilling counterpoint to Joran's fevered defiance. He did not address Joran directly, nor did he even glance at Eris. Instead, he spoke to the crowd, his voice a low, resonant drum that beat against their deepest fears. He spoke of their shared blood, the sacred fluid that connected every single one of them, a river of kinship that had flowed unbroken for 5 generations. He reminded them of the storms that had dashed other ships against their rocks, ships whose crews had looked upon them not as fellow humans, but as monsters. He painted a vivid picture of the world outside, a world of strangers who would see their identical faces not as a mark of unity, but as a freakish curse, a world that would lock them away, study them, or simply destroy them. Their island was not a prison, he insisted, it was a sanctuary. Their traditions were not horrors, but the very rituals that preserved them from a far greater horror, the rejection and annihilation that awaited beyond the fog. His words were a masterful manipulation, weaving their isolation and their deformities into a shield. He asked them to look at each other, to see not a collection of individuals, but a single, enduring organism. The unity he offered was not born of love or shared purpose, but of a shared, terrified understanding that they had nowhere else to go, that they were fundamentally, irrevocably other. The flicker of rebellion in the eyes of the young ones died, extinguished by the cold water of reality. Joran's defiance suddenly seemed not brave, but suicidal, a threat to the fragile, bloody equilibrium that kept them all alive. The rebellion was quelled not with force, but with a reminder of their collective fear. The price of unity, Eris realized with a sickening clarity, was the total surrender of the individual, and it was a price every villager, save for Joran and himself, seemed willing to pay. The raft, their symbol of hope, now felt like a child's toy against the immovable weight of the island's terrible truth. The twin moons rose as they always did on the longest night of the season, 2 luminous orbs hanging in the clear, cold sky like the unblinking eyes of a celestial judge. For the first time since Eris's arrival, the island's perpetual fog had retreated, as if commanded by the occasion, revealing a vault of stars so sharp and bright they looked like ice chips. The village was transformed. Torches, far more numerous than usual, blazed in a great ring around the central clearing, their light painting the familiar, identical faces in shades of gold and orange, softening the harsh lines of their shared features. This was the festival of purity, a celebration of the very genetic singularity that Eris found so monstrous. The air thrummed with a sound he had not heard before, music. It was a discordant, rhythmic pounding on skin drums and a high, reedy piping that seemed to mimic the wind through the rocks. The villagers, all of them, moved into the center of the ring of fire. They did not walk. They flowed, their bodies swaying and stepping in perfect, unnerving unison. It was a dance without joy, a ritual of synchronization. Their arms rose and fell as one. Their feet stamped the hard earth in a single percussive beat. They were a single entity with dozens of bodies, a living testament to their shared blood, their movements a physical prayer to their own homogeneity. Eris watched from the shadows, feeling more an outsider than ever. This was not a festival. It was a reaffirmation, a grotesque ballet of conformity. Elder Kale stood at the edge of the dancers, a still point in the swirling motion, his face uplifted to the twin moons. He was dressed in a cloak sewn from patches of strangely textured leather, and around his neck, something glinted in the torchlight. It was a locket, an object of such fine, alien craftsmanship it stood out starkly against the crude bone and leather of his attire. It was old, made of tarnished silver, and as Cale turned his head to survey his people, the firelight caught its surface, sending a brilliant flash into Eris's eyes. Eris's breath caught in his throat. He knew that locket. He had seen it in faded photographs on his grandmother's mantelpiece, a cherished heirloom of the man who had vanished decades ago on an ill-fated anthropological expedition. His grandfather, Dr. Alistair Finch. The world seemed to tilt. The scholarly curiosity, the horror, the fear, all of it coalesced into a single piercing point of dread. This was no random shipwreck. He had been drawn to this place by a thread of blood. He waited, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, until the dance reached its crescendo and began to subside. As the villagers broke their formation, their synchronized unity dissolving into murmured conversations, Eris moved. He crossed the clearing, his gaze locked on Cale, on the locket that rested against the elder's chest. He did not ask. He simply reached out, his fingers closing around the cold metal before Cale could react. The elder's eyes, those ancient, weary mirrors, widened in surprise, then narrowed. But he did not pull away. He watched as Eris pried the tiny clasp open. Inside, protected by a thin pane of clouded glass, was a sepia-toned photograph. The face that looked out was younger, the features sharper, but unmistakable. The keen, intelligent eyes, the strong jaw, the slight, confident smile. It was his grandfather. And standing beside him in the photo, his arm linked with Alistair's, was a younger version of Elder Cale. His face unlined, his eyes holding a hope that had long since been extinguished. Eris looked from the photograph to Cale's face, the familial link now a terrifying bridge between his world and this one. The pieces of the island's history shifted, locking into a new, more personal configuration. The dark connection was no longer an abstract horror. It was his inheritance. Cale gently took the locket back, closing it with a soft click that sounded like a final verdict. He did not deny it. Instead, he offered a hint, his voice a dry, sorrowful whisper meant only for Eris. He spoke of a brilliant man who had come to study them, a man who saw their plight not as a tragedy but as a unique evolutionary event. A man who had chosen to stay, to guide them, to become part of the experiment. He had not been a victim of the island. He had been its architect. Cale's gaze held Eris's, and in its depths, Eris saw not just the history of the community, but the shadow of his own bloodline. The guilt was not something he had stumbled upon. It was something he had carried ashore with him. The celebration of purity continued around them, a mocking backdrop to the revelation that the horror of the island was, in part, a family legacy. The revelry of the festival curdled with the dawn, leaving behind a village haunted by the clarity of the twin moons. The brief respite from the fog had been an illusion, and the gray pall returned, thicker and heavier than before, as if to smother the dangerous ideas that the starlight might have inspired. For Eris, the world had fundamentally shifted. The island was no longer just a place of anthropological nightmare. It was a family secret, a cursed heirloom whose weight now pressed directly upon his soul. But this personal horror was soon eclipsed by a more immediate and visceral one. The unraveling of Alara. It began subtly. Eris noticed her standing motionless by the well, her bucket forgotten at her feet, her head cocked as if listening to a sound only she could hear. Her lips moved, forming silent, shapeless words. When he approached, she started violently, her eyes wide with a confusion that was more profound than simple surprise. She looked at him not as Eris, the outsider, but as if trying to place a face from a dream. That evening, in the dim confines of her hut, the whispers began. They were not in the common tongue of the village, but a guttural, fractured babble. A cacophony of voices speaking over one another in a language that was both alien and horrifyingly familiar. She would clutch her head, rocking back and forth, her own voice rising to argue with the phantoms in her mind. Eris tended to her as best he could, dampening her brow with a cloth, trying to anchor her with his presence. In her rare moments of lucidity, her terror was absolute. She confessed to him that the voices were not her own. They were the consumed. She could hear Bren's calm resignation warring with the frantic fear of her own sister. She could hear the first-generation woman from the journal lamenting her choices. The act of cannibalism, meant to integrate the dead into the living whole, had become a form of psychic possession. Alara's mind, already strained by grief and fear, was becoming a crowded grave, each consumed ancestor adding their voice to a chorus of the damned. From a villager named Lyra, a woman whose face was a perfect copy of Alara's, but whose eyes held a pragmatic coldness, Eris learned the terrible commonality of it. Lyra spoke of the madness not as a tragedy, but as a seasonal blight, like a rot that affects the weakest crops. She called it the echoing. It was a known affliction. She explained with a shrug, a direct result of their purity. With so little genetic variation, the mind's defenses grew brittle. The memories, the essences, they consumed did not digest. They lingered, their psychic imprint overwhelming the fragile barriers of individual identity. The very unity they celebrated was a recipe for psychosis. Sanity on the island was not a default state but a temporary fragile victory over an inevitable internal tide. The truth of Lyra's words was proven not in the quiet agony of Alara's hut, but in the violent heart of the village. A man named Corin, known for his quiet diligence, was mending a fishing net when he suddenly froze. He stared at the hands of the man working beside him, a man named Finn. Their hands, like their faces, were identical, but Corin's eyes widened in dawning horror. He began to shout, not at Finn, but at his own reflection in a nearby water basin. He accused the reflection of stealing his life, of wearing his face. The confusion of identity, a theoretical horror, became a bloody reality. With a guttural cry, Corin launched himself at Finn, his hands clawing at the face that was a mirror of his own, screaming that he wanted his own skin back. The fight was brief but brutal, a tangle of identical limbs, a nightmare of self-destruction. It took 3 other men to pull Corin away, his fingers dripping with blood drawn from his own genetic copy. Finn lay panting on the ground, his face a ruin of scratches, staring up at his attacker with an expression of bewildered betrayal. The violence was not born of anger, but of a profound, shattering disorientation. Corin had looked at Finn and seen not a brother, but a usurper of his very soul. Eris watched the scene unfold, his arms wrapped around a trembling Alara who had been drawn from her hut by the commotion. She watched the struggle, her own eyes reflecting the same chaotic terror that had seized Corin. The villager's public breakdown was a dark mirror of her private one. The fragility of sanity was not an abstract concept. It was the central, pulsing truth of the island. The community was a vase already cracked, and with every ritual, every meal, every passing generation, the fractures deepened until the entire structure threatened to shatter into a million identical, screaming pieces. Alara's descent was not an anomaly. It was the future of them all. The violence of Corin's breakdown had left a stain on the village, a palpable tension that hummed louder than the island's own strange drone. The community moved through their chores with a new wariness, their identical eyes flicking nervously towards one another, no longer seeing kin but potential usurpers of their own fragile identities. For Eris, the incident was the final catalyst. The anthropological observer was gone, replaced by a man desperate for an answer, for a reason that could make the horror intelligible. He needed to confront the source, the architect of this ruin. He needed to speak with Elder Kale, not as a guest to a host, but as a descendant to a confessor. He found Kale in the longhouse, alone, seated at the head of the great table where the welcoming feast had been held. The hall was empty, the torches unlit, leaving the space filled with a gloomy, gray light from the open doorway. Kale was not presiding. He was simply sitting, his hands resting on the worn wood, his gaze fixed on nothing. He looked ancient, the weight of generations bowing his shoulders. He did not seem surprised to see Eris. He merely gestured to the bench beside him, an invitation that felt like an acknowledgement of an inevitable conversation. Eris did not sit. He stood over the old man, the locket's revelation burning in his mind. He demanded the full story, not the sanitized version for the community, not the hints and half-truths. He demanded the truth of the cannibalism, the truth of the genetic mirror, the truth of his grandfather's role. His voice, though low, echoed in the vast, empty hall. Cale did not flinch from the confrontation. He looked up, his weary eyes meeting Eris's, and the defenses of the elder fell away, leaving only a profound and exhausted honesty. He admitted that the cannibalism had begun as Eris suspected, a dire solution to starvation. But it had evolved, he explained, into something far more deliberate, far more sinister. It became a tool for purification. In the second generation, as the first clear deformities began to appear, a theory took hold. By consuming those who died, especially those who exhibited physical or mental aberrations, they were not just recycling nutrients. They were purging the impurities from the communal body. They were burning the flawed blueprints, hoping to strengthen the dominant, stable patterns. He spoke with a chilling, scientific detachment, as if discussing a failed crop rotation. The goal, he said, was to achieve a state of perfect genetic harmony. The lottery was not just a means of population control. It was a eugenic filter. Over generations, the practice, combined with the strictly enforced inbreeding to keep the bloodline pure and avoid introducing new, unpredictable traits, had achieved a terrifying success. The community's DNA, he stated flatly, was now 99% identical. They were less a family and more a colony, a cluster of near clones, their individuality sanded away by the relentless pressure of survival and a twisted ideal of purity. Seeing the horror on Eris's face, Cale rose slowly, his joints protesting. He led Eris to a small, windowless room at the back of the longhouse, a space Eris had assumed was for storage. Inside, on a crude shelf, lay a series of ledgers, their bindings cracked and stained. These were the official records, the cold, hard data behind the oral tradition and the cave carvings. Cale opened one, its pages filled with dense, meticulous script and simple charts. He showed Eris the pairings. They were not recorded as marriages, but as breeding assignments. The logs detailed every union, not by choice or affection, but by a calculated effort to reinforce the desired traits and breed out the undesired ones. Cousins were paired with cousins, then brothers with sisters, the records becoming a grim flowchart of diminishing genetic diversity. The logs noted the offspring with clinical notes on their health, their conformity, their usefulness. Children who were too deformed were marked with a single, stark symbol, a small, drawn bone, indicating they were not chosen for the lottery, but simply removed. It was a ledger of forced inbreeding, a deliberate strangulation of their own gene pool to avoid the perceived greater threat of extinction through diversity. It was not an accident of isolation. It was a policy. This was the engine of their twisted evolution, a conscious descent into homogeneity in the desperate, monstrous belief that it was the only way to endure. Hope was a dangerous, fragile thing to build on an island of despair, but the raft was their blasphemy, their prayer. Under the cloak of a moonless, drizzling night, Eris and Joran worked in the skeletal embrace of a sea-wrecked grove on the island's northern shore. The air was thick with the salt tang of decay and the whispered secrets of the forest at their backs. Joran, his body twisted by scoliosis into a permanent question mark, moved with a frantic, efficient energy that defied his form. He directed Eris in hushed, urgent tones, their hands binding lengths of bleached driftwood together with tough, sinewy vines. Each knot tied was a defiance of Elder Cale's law. Each log positioned a rejection of the island's bloody communion. The raft was small, little more than a platform, but to Eris, it was a vessel of salvation, a chance to carry the truth away from this genetic graveyard. They had nearly finished the basic frame when the jungle behind them fell silent. The constant, subtle chorus of night insects ceased as if a switch had been thrown. Joran froze, his head cocked, his good eye wide. Eris felt the shift, a sudden pressure in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. Then, a twig snapped, a sound as loud as a gunshot in the unnatural hush. Figures emerged from the dripping darkness between the trees, not with the slow, deliberate unison of the villagers, but with the swift, predatory purpose of hunters. Kale's enforcers. Their identical faces were grim masks in the faint starlight, their eyes holding no curiosity, only the cold intent of a task to be completed. There was no warning, no demand for surrender. The chase began instantly, a frantic explosion of motion. Eris and Joran abandoned their half-built hope and plunged into the dense, tangled undergrowth of the jungle. Thorns ripped at their clothes and skin, and the wet leaves slapped against their faces like cold, mocking hands. Eris's lungs burned, his civilized muscles screaming in protest, but adrenaline lent him a desperate speed. He could hear the enforcers crashing through the vegetation behind them, their movements synchronized, a single-minded predator with multiple bodies. Joran, despite his crooked spine, knew the land with an intimate, desperate knowledge. He led them on a twisting, erratic path, through a stream that ran icy cold over slick stones and under the low, sweeping boughs of ancient, gnarled trees. But his body betrayed him. A root snaked out from the darkness, catching his bad foot. He stumbled with a choked cry, his momentum carrying him forward into a painful, sprawling fall. Eris skidded to a halt, turning back to help, but Joran was already pushing himself up, his face a rictus of pain and determination. He met Eris's eyes, and in that brief, silent exchange, a terrible understanding passed between them. They would not both escape. With a final, fierce shake of his head, Joran turned to face their pursuers. He did not stand and fight. Instead, he let out a raw, guttural shout, a challenge that echoed through the trees, and then he broke to the right, crashing through the foliage with as much noise as he could muster. It was a diversion, a sacrifice. The enforcers, drawn by the sound, veered after him, their forms swallowed by the jungle's darkness. Eris stood frozen for a heartbeat, torn between the instinct to help and the crushing certainty of Joran's intent. The sound of the chase receded, and then was cut off by a single, sharp cry that was abruptly silenced. Despair, cold and absolute, threatened to paralyze him. But Joran's sacrifice demanded a purpose. Forcing his limbs to move, Eris turned and ran in the opposite direction, deeper into the unknown. He ran until the stitch in his side was a white-hot agony and his legs threatened to buckle. Finally, he stumbled into a small, concealed crevice between two massive, moss-covered boulders, squeezing his body into the damp, narrow space. He pressed himself against the cold stone, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps that he fought to silence. He listened, but heard only the drip of water and the slow, returning hum of the insects. Joran was gone, consumed by the very unity he had sought to escape. When his heart had stilled its frantic pounding, Eris crawled from his hiding place. The jungle was quiet again, holding its secrets close. Disoriented and grief-stricken, he moved with no direction, simply putting distance between himself and the sight of Joran's capture. The land began to slope downward, the vegetation thinning as the rocky ground gave way to a steep, crumbling cliff face. Clinging to tough, salt-resistant shrubs, he half slid, half climbed down the escarpment, his hands torn and bleeding. He landed on a narrow strip of coarse, white sand, hidden from the sea above by the curve of the cliff. It was a secluded cove, a perfect pocket of isolation. And there, nestled against the cliff wall, partially reclaimed by creeping vines and sand drifts, were the ruins. It was not a native structure. The corroded metal skeleton of a prefabricated hut jutted from the greenery, and nearby a larger, more solid building of poured concrete stood, its windows gaping empty holes. A weather-faded symbol was still visible on the wall beside a heavy, rusted door, a stylized helix encircled by a laurel wreath. This was no shipwreck survivors' camp. It was an old research station. In the crushing despair of Joran's loss, the ruins stood as a stark, silent promise of answers, a sliver of hope in the gathering darkness. The silence that followed Joran's sacrifice was not peaceful. It was the tense, breathless quiet of a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. Eris, hidden within the skeletal remains of the research station, felt the island itself straining. The fragile societal dam, built from fear, tradition, and Kale's iron will, had been cracked by Joran's rebellion. With the elders' authority challenged and the enforcers scattered from their failed pursuit, the underlying terror that had always fueled the community now boiled over, unchecked. The balance was broken, and the blood tide began to rise. It started with a dispute over a cache of dried fish, a pitifully small hoard discovered in a hollow tree. In the past, such a find would have been brought to the longhouse for communal distribution. Now, two families, their faces mirror images of greed and desperation, turned on each other. There were no shouted arguments, no appeals to Kale. The violence was swift and brutal, a silent, grunting struggle over the meager prize. It ended with a man, his features a perfect copy of his attackers, bleeding out on the forest floor, his throat torn open by a sharpened bone tool. The sanctity of shared blood, Kale's ultimate weapon, evaporated in an instant. The community shattered into a dozen warring factions, each a closed circle of identical faces defending their scrap of territory, their handful of food. Eris, watching from the cover of the station's broken window, saw the island's final horror unfold. The ritualized, resigned cannibalism of the lottery devolved into a raw, frenzied hunger. The taboo against consuming the living, the last vestige of their humanity, was swept away by the primal need to survive. He saw a group descend upon the man who had just been killed in the fish dispute, not with the solemn efficiency of the butcher's hut, but with a savage urgency. They did not wait for the body to cool, did not clean or prepare it. They fell upon it with their hands and teeth, their identical faces smeared with blood, their eyes wide with a madness that was no longer individual but collective. It was no longer about integrating the dead. It was about erasing them, absorbing their strength before another could. The village green became a charnel ground, the air thick with the sounds of tearing flesh and wet, animalistic feeding. And then he saw Ilara. She emerged from the tree line, her gait unsteady, her limp more pronounced. The careful, fearful woman was gone, replaced by a specter. Her hair was wild, her clothes torn, and her eyes held a luminous, unhinged clarity. She did not join the frenzy with hunger. She walked into the midst of it as if entering a grand ballroom. A man, his back to her, was hunched over a body. He turned, his face a mask of gore, and snarled at her intrusion. Ilara did not flinch. She stepped closer, her head tilting, and a beatific, terrifying smile spread across her lips. She was looking at her own face. The snarling man, in his rage and hunger, was her perfect duplicate. She reached out a trembling hand and touched his bloody cheek. He recoiled, but she followed, her smile widening. She saw her reflection in every face, in every pair of wild, identical eyes. The madness that had been consuming her from within now found its mirror in the world. The internal chorus of consumed voices was now a physical reality. She was not one among many. She was all of them, and they were all her. She began to laugh, a high, silvery sound that cut through the grunts and snarls, a sound of perfect, insane recognition. She wandered through the chaos, not as a participant, but as an observer of her own fragmented soul, touching an arm here, a shoulder there, seeing herself in every act of violence, in every face contorted by hunger. The collapse of humanity was, for her, a reunion. The cove was a cathedral of silence, broken only by the soft lap of waves against the sand and the rustle of wind through the vines that choked the ruins. The air inside the derelict research station was thick with the smell of rust, damp concrete, and the profound stillness of abandonment. Eris moved through the skeletal remains of a world that should not exist, his footsteps echoing in the hollow space. The prefabricated walls were corroded, panels hanging like loose skin, revealing the rusted bones of their framework. He pushed open the heavy, stubborn door of the main concrete building. It's grown a protest against the intrusion of the present into a sealed past. The interior was a time capsule of organized science devoured by neglect. Metal desks were overturned, their contents spilled across the floor. Yellowed papers, shattered glassware, and the brittle skeletons of small animals. But against the far wall, a bank of machines stood, their bulky, antiquated forms surprisingly intact under a shroud of dust and cobwebs. He recognized the shape of a centrifuge, the bulky console of an early DNA sequencer. This was not the equipment of castaways. This was a laboratory. His heart began to pound, not with fear, but with a dreadful rising certainty. He brushed the thick dust from the sequencer's display screen. Faded labels above switches read, electrophoresis chamber, thermal cycler, genomic analysis. This was where the theory had been proven, where the horror had been quantified. In a drawer warped by moisture, he found the logs. They were not ledgers of breeding pairs, but clinical, bound notebooks filled with graphs, chromatograms, and dense, technical script. He carried them to a sliver of light falling through a broken window, the pages crackling with age as he turned them. The data was unequivocal. Page after page detailed the analysis of blood and tissue samples, tracking the genetic markers of the community over generations. The early entries showed a healthy, if limited, diversity among the original survivors. But with each successive generation, the graphs narrowed, the peaks of genetic variation flattening into a single dominant spike. The final entries, dated just a few decades ago, were stark in their conclusion. A summary page, headed Final Genomic Assessment, contained a single, devastating sentence. Asterisk subject population now exhibits 992% genetic identity across all sampled loci. The experiment has reached a state of effective clonal homogeneity. The words seemed to burn on the page. The islanders were not just inbred. They were a population of near clones, their individuality erased not by chance, but by a deliberate scientific process. The cannibalism, the enforced breeding, it had all been in service of this terrifying purity. He was not studying a tragic accident of isolation. He was witnessing the successful, monstrous conclusion of a long-term experiment. The community was the data, and the data was a mirror reflecting a single, repeating face. His eyes fell on a name scrawled at the bottom of the final report, a signature he knew from family documents and academic legends. Dr. Alistair Finch, project lead. The shock of the locket was nothing compared to this. His grandfather had not just been present. He had been in command. A wave of nausea washed over him as he frantically searched through the other logs, pulling files from a rusted cabinet. He found the project proposal, its cover sheet emblazoned with the same helical symbol from the wall. The title was Dry, Academic, Observational Study on Extreme Population Bottlenecking and Accelerated Genetic Drift. But the objective was chilling: to document the sociological and biological adaptations of a closed human population under conditions of severe resource limitation and reproductive isolation. This was no rescue mission gone wrong. His grandfather had stranded these people. He had used them. The shipwreck was not a tragedy. It was a methodology. The logs contained supply manifests not for survival but for establishing a base. They spoke of selecting a viable founding population and implementing control parameters to ensure the experiment's integrity. The cannibalism, the inbreeding, these were not desperate acts of survival stumbled upon by survivors. They were the predicted, and perhaps even encouraged, outcomes of the experimental design. Eris's grandfather had created this hellish microcosm to satisfy his scientific curiosity, to watch humanity strip itself down to its most brutal, essential components. The island was his petri dish, and the villagers were his lab rats. Their suffering a data point, their horrific unity a successful result. The scientific horror was not in what Eris had discovered about the island, but in the bloodline he carried. He was the grandson of the devil who had engineered this mirror, and he was staring into its terrible, repeating reflection. The truth was a poison, and it coursed through Eris's veins as he hid among the rusted bones of his grandfather's legacy. The 992% genetic identity was no longer a statistic. It was the ghost in every pair of identical, maddened eyes, the scream in Alara's laughter. He had become a relic himself, the last repository of a history too monstrous to bear, and the island, sensing his foreignness like a body rejects a graft, was determined to expel him. They found him not with a chase, but with a quiet, inevitable convergence. As he tried to decipher another faded log entry, figures materialized in the broken doorway of the lab, their forms blotting out the gray light. They did not rush him. They simply stood, waiting. Behind them stood Elder Kale, his face a granite mask of finality. There was no fight left in Eris. His resistance was spent, his hope extinguished with Joran. He allowed his arms to be bound, the coarse vine biting into his wrists, and was led back to the village not as a prisoner of war, but as a ritual offering. The clearing was prepared. The flat stone dais, the altar of the lottery, had been scrubbed clean. The villagers, those who were still capable of coherent action, formed their silent ring, but the circle was fractured, incomplete. Many were missing, lost to the forest or the frenzy. Those who remained watched with a hollowed-out emptiness, their identical features slack with trauma. They were a congregation awaiting a sacrament they no longer understood, hoping the spilling of the outsider's blood might somehow reset the terrible equation their world had become. The full moon, cold and brilliant, cast sharp, black shadows, illuminating the scene with a merciless clarity. It was a perfect night for an execution. Kale led him to the dais. The old man's movements were slow, weighted with a profound weariness. He held a ceremonial knife, its blade a sliver of obsidian that gleamed like a shard of the night itself. He raised it, not with triumph, but with the resignation of a man performing a necessary, ugly chore. The ritual words began, the same words he had spoken for the lottery, but now they sounded hollow, a spell that had lost its power. This was the moment. Eris knew he could not fight with strength, so he fought with the only weapon he had left, the truth. He did not plead for his life. Instead, he spoke directly to Kale, his voice low but clear in the expectant silence. He spoke not of fear or mercy, but of the man in the locket. He spoke of Alistair Finch not as a brilliant scientist, but as a coward who had fled his own creation, leaving Kale to bear the burden of his monstrous experiment. He described the logs, the cold, clinical language that reduced their suffering to data points, their lives to a successful outcome. He forced Kale to see himself not as a leader preserving his people, but as a caretaker of a failed experiment, a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the twisted legacy of a ghost. Kale's arm, holding the knife, did not lower, but a tremor ran through it. The granite mask of his face cracked, revealing a fissure of unbearable pain. He looked at Eris, and for the first time he did not see an outsider or a sacrifice. He saw a grandson. He saw the living proof of the world that had abandoned them, the world his own mentor had betrayed. He saw the cycle, the lies, the forced breeding, the consuming hunger, stretching back generations, and he saw himself as the latest link in a chain of damnation. The obsidian knife did not plunge into Eris's heart. Instead, Kale's grip shifted. He turned the blade inward. A sigh, heavy with 5 generations of regret, escaped his lips. It was not a cry of pain, but of release. He looked out at his people, his broken, mirrored children, and in his eyes was not the fire of fanaticism, but the deep, bottomless sorrow of a shepherd who had led his flock over a cliff. With a final, decisive motion, he drove the knife into his own chest. He fell to his knees on the stone dais, his lifeblood pooling around him, black in the moonlight. As he slumped forward, the neck of his tunic gaped open. The torchlight fell upon his bared torso, and Eris saw what the heavy robes had always concealed. The skin was not smooth. It was a landscape of lumpy, thickened tissue, of strange, ropus scars that twisted across his ribs and spine. The hidden deformities of the inbred, the physical truth he had spent a lifetime masking with authority. In death, Kale's own body revealed the cost of his stewardship. His final act was not one of power, but of penance. He had chosen to sacrifice the last vestige of the experiment's control himself, in a desperate, futile attempt at redemption. The last sacrifice was not for order, but for loss, a final, bloody acknowledgement that some legacies are too heavy to carry. The silence that followed Elder Kale's collapse was more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of a mechanism whose mainspring has snapped. The villagers ringing the dais did not rush forward. They did not cry out. They simply stood, their identical faces blank with a shock so total it erased even the madness that had gripped them. The pillar of their world had fallen, and with it, the last semblance of structure crumbled into dust. The authority that had enforced the lottery, justified the feasts, and maintained the bloody equilibrium was gone, leaving only the raw, screaming ID of the community exposed. The final descent began not with a roar, but with a whimper, as the circle broke and the villagers melted away into the shadows, each returning to their private hells. Eris stood alone beside Kale's body, the coppery smell of blood thick in the air. The moon illuminated the stark truth on the elder's bared torso, the hidden deformities that were the true legacy of his rule. This was not a victory. It was a catastrophic system failure. From the surrounding darkness, new sounds began to emerge. Not the organized violence of the blood tide, but the unstructured chaos of complete psychological collapse. A woman was rhythmically beating her head against a hut post. A man was digging frantically at the earth with his bare hands, as if he could burrow back into a time before the horror. The community had become a bedlam of isolated souls, each trapped in their own echoing skull. He had to get out. The resolve was a cold, clear certainty. Joran's raft. The thought was a lifeline. He slipped away from the dais, moving through the village like a ghost. In the ruins of a hut trampled during the earlier frenzy, he found a child. A boy, no older than 7, was huddled under a collapsed hide, his body trembling violently. He was one of the few whose face showed not madness, but a pure, undiluted terror. He was still sane, a flickering candle in the overwhelming dark. When Eris reached for him, the boy flinched, but then clutched at his hand with a desperate strength. He was an echo of the humanity that had been lost, a reason to try. Gathering the boy onto his back, Eris moved toward the northern shore, avoiding the central clearing where the worst of the feeding had occurred. He found 2 others along the way, a young woman staring catatonically at her own hands, and an older man with a badly injured leg, who nonetheless possessed a grim clarity in his eyes. They were the salvageable ones, the last fragments of a shattered vase. With gestures and urgent whispers, he gathered them, and they fled the village, leaving the cacophony of madness behind them. The journey to the cove was a nightmare trek. The jungle itself seemed to resist their escape, its thorns clutching at them, its uneven terrain a torture for the injured man. Behind them, an orange glow began to stain the lower sky. Someone, in their insanity, had set a fire. The dry thatch of the huts caught quickly, and soon the entire village was outlined in a raging inferno, a funeral pyre for a failed experiment. The light cast their long, frantic shadows ahead of them as they stumbled onward. The raft was where he and Joran had left it, a pathetic-looking assemblage of driftwood and vine, but it was intact. Working with a frantic, shared purpose, they dragged it to the water's edge. The sea was mercifully calm, the waves gentle rollers that slapped softly against the sand. As they pushed the crude vessel into the surf, Eris took one last look back. The island was a torch against the night, the flames climbing into the sky, consuming the bones, the journals, the genetic mirror. It was a fitting end, a purification by fire. They paddled away from shore using their hands and flat pieces of wood, the cold water soaking them to the bone. The boy huddled against Eris, his small body shivering. When they were 100 yards out, a section of the cliff face, undermined by the fire, collapsed into the sea with a roar that drowned out the crackling of the flames. The island was devouring itself. As dawn began to bleach the eastern horizon, the landmass was reduced to a smoking silhouette, a dark stain on the sea. Eris watched it vanish into the haze, the weight of the boy against him a tangible burden. He had escaped with his life and with a few others, but he carried a far heavier cargo. He knew the truth of the 992%, the story of Alistair Finch, the horrific logic of the experiment. To bring that knowledge to the world would be to unleash a different kind of plague, of fascination, exploitation, and fear. The outside world was not ready for the echo of humanity he had found. It would pick at the bones of the story, try to replicate the conditions, see the islanders as subjects rather than victims. His vow formed not as a conscious decision, but as an instinct deeper than survival. He would bury the truth as deeply as the island was buried beneath the waves. The burden of knowledge was his alone to bear, a secret he would carry to his grave to protect a world that could never understand the price of its own curiosity. The raft drifted on the open sea, a tiny speck carrying the last echo of a terrible silence. The package arrived on a Tuesday, a day indistinguishable from any other in the long, gray procession of Elias Eris's life. It was a plain, brown cardboard box, devoid of a return address, its surface slightly damp from the persistent drizzle that clung to the city. It had been years, but the sight of it, sitting innocently on his welcome mat, sent a jolt of primal fear through his system that was more potent than any memory. His hands, which had grown steady in the quiet safety of academia, trembled as he carried it inside, the weight of it all wrong, too dense, too specific. He placed it on his kitchen table, a sterile, modern surface that seemed to recoil from the box's mute presence. For a long time, he simply stared at it, the hum of his refrigerator the only sound in the apartment, a poor imitation of the island's drone. He did not need to open it to know. The past had not been buried by the sea. It had simply been biding its time, washing up on his shore like a message in a bottle from a damned ship. With a deliberate slowness that belied the frantic pounding of his heart, he sliced the tape with a kitchen knife. Nestled inside a bed of styrofoam peanuts were bones. Not a full skeleton, but a selection, a femur, a partial mandible, a cluster of vertebrae. They were clean, bleached white by sun and salt, but they were not ancient. They were accompanied by a single sheet of paper, a lab report from a private genetic testing facility. His eyes scanned the technical jargon, the columns of numbers, until they found the line that confirmed his deepest, most unspoken dread. Asterisk sample comparison. Subject A, provided bone, and Subject B, Elias Eris, baseline. Probability of shared genetic origin, 991% star. The number was a key that unlocked a door he had sealed shut in his mind. The raft, the fire, the vow of silence. It had all been a futile attempt to contain a truth that was viral, replicant. He had not escaped the legacy. He had carried it within him all along. The island had not been a closed system. There had been others before his grandfather's experiment, other shipwrecks, other castaways absorbed into the bloody communion. Or perhaps, in the early, chaotic days of the community, before the experiment was fully codified, someone had escaped. However it had happened, the genetic code of the island had leaked into the world's gene pool. The 99% match was not a relic. It was a living, breathing lineage. There were descendants walking the streets of this very city, their faces unique, their lives ordinary, but carrying inside them the ghost of that terrible unity. The horror was not over. It was simply dispersed, hiding in plain sight, a dormant echo waiting for the right conditions to amplify. Days later, under a sky the color of lead, Eris stood before a simple granite headstone in a rain-swept cemetery. It was not the grave of anyone he had known on the island, but of his own father, a quiet man who had died years before Eris's fateful expedition, a man who had never spoken of his own father, the vanished Alastair Finch. Eris placed a hand on the cold, wet stone, the chill seeping into his bones. He looked out over the rows of markers, each representing a single, unique life, a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. But were they unique? Or were they all just variations on a handful of themes, their differences skin-deep, their darkest impulses, the greed, the fear, the capacity for monstrous acts in the name of survival, a shared, fundamental inheritance? He thought of the island, not as an aberration, but as an intensifying lens. It had taken the latent tendencies of humanity, the tribalism, the fear of the other, the desperate will to live, and amplified them to a logical, horrific extreme. The cannibalism, the inbreeding, the descent into madness, were these truly alien, or were they just the endpoint of a path any isolated, terrified community could walk? The legacy in the bones was not just a specific genetic sequence. It was the proof of a terrifying plasticity. Humanity was not inherently good or evil, but adaptable, capable of molding itself into any shape required by its environment, no matter how grotesque. The island had asked a question of its people, and they had answered with their flesh and blood. The enduring horror was the realization that the same question lingered in the heart of every society, and the answer was always terrifyingly possible. The burden was no longer just a secret to keep. It was a question to live with, a doubt etched into his soul as permanently as the carvings in the cave. The legacy was not in the bones on his table. It was in the bone-deep knowledge that the darkness was not out there, but in here, a shared, ancestral whisper that could never truly be escaped.